Hi, everybody. We're just going to do a quick audio test. If you can hear me, type yes into the chat box. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our Summer CPE Learning Series. Today's webinar program will be presented by Samantha Hoyte to discuss the risks of COVID-19 1 year later. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Materials for today's presentation can be found in the toolbar located on the right of your screen. At the bottom of the toolbar, you will see a question box. All questions pertaining to the webinar content will be answered at the end. We will do our best to address them. Please be sure to answer all of the polling questions to ensure that you receive CPE credits for today's session. And once the webinar is over, there will be a pop-up asking you to complete a survey of today's webinar. Please take a moment to complete it. It's our way of being able to provide you with the best and most relevant programs possible. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for session number 6, the risk of COVID-19 1 year later. So basically, we had this presentation last year at the kind of the beginning of the pandemic. We did it in May. So we're going to revisit some of the topics that we talked about then, but kind of update them this year, where it's more or less of a reflection, like how did these things that we discussed, how did they impact your firm? What did you do? What can we do looking forward? And just give us that reflection that's needed. So today we'll be discussing again the potential business and economic risks resulting from COVID-19. We're going to understand the risk assessment process. We're going to go over a little bit of the review of the results of risk mitigation, because as we discussed last year when we did this presentation, we listed out certain areas of focus, things to consider. So we want to know, what are the results of taking that step last year? And then again, addressing any lingering implications as a result of the changes that we had to implement. So what are the business risks that we see, particularly related to COVID? Because business risks always are in existence. But what we tried to do is tailor this more for what we were seeing as a result of the pandemic. Working remotely was the biggest thing that came out of it. Questions and risks that arose were, the security, the availability of everyone, keeping up those productivities from being in the office. All these are things that were impacted by having a shift to working remotely. How do we secure the information, our clients' information, donor information, our personal information, because it's partially affected to working remotely, but then also the people that we deal with are working remotely. So now a lot of information is coming through the web as opposed to regular mail and paper. How did we do with achieving our company objectives? I know many of the not-for-profits, they had certain goals or annual fundraising events, all those type of things that, were short-term in nature that had to change as, event spaces had to close down, restaurants closed down, the restrictions on going outdoors. And then what does that mean for our long-term goals? Fundraising could be short-term for our operations, but also to help us achieve those long-term expansive objectives that we have. Cash management. Did we feel an impact to our cash flow? Did we see that dip that we would expect from the impact of pandemic on the world right now? Did we have enough cash in store that we can maintain our expenses until we got over the hump? And of course, in this case, we saw it was definitely an ever-changing environment. Software developers changed. They had to increase uh, the capacity as more people switched offline, more people, they had more business now. So that changed. The government rulings changed as they were putting out funds in an event to help everyone out. There was ever changing with that. And then that also impacted, loss of funding. Some of the companies that we had, there were some, even though they may had the financial capability to give, they kind of withheld on giving because for their own financial sustainability, they weren't sure what tomorrow will bring. So is a possibility that there might have been a loss of funding from entities who were trying to maintain their cash in order to foresee the future. And one of the new things that came out that we're adding this year, wasn't really a big thing last year, was the CARES Act funding and other relief money. As we see, the government was sending out a lot of funding in different tranches. Different industries received additional funding. And it was just always changing. So the requirements changed. I know one of the entities that I worked on is actually a college, and for the CARES Act money that came out from the college, they came out with a set of requirements and reporting that seemed to have constantly evolved during the year. So that was definitely one of those things that was very risky because you had to be on top of their changing requirements. And then the situation that we find ourselves in right now is, the reopening and resuming. I know I'm here in New Jersey. We're pretty much reopened now, and everyone is getting back into it. Some people have opened back in fully, some are not open back in fully, and there's some who are still waiting to open back up to see the impact of those who are open. So basically, these risks that we've identified here, these are things that we need to be constantly analyzing and assessing in an ongoing process. So we touched base on this last year, so that's why they're still here this year. So it's not to say that we're at the end of the pandemic and these things have disappeared. They're all still risks that we need to be evaluating on an ongoing basis. So next, what I want to go over is some of what the impact, like what does it look like on the economy from us 1 year later from the pandemic. So what I have here is I took a quarterly run of the three major markets, Dow Jones, S&P 500, NASDAQ, and I charted to see how did they react during the pandemic. So here we started with January 2020, where that was before the shuts down and we got hit in the US full force by the pandemic. By April 20th, we see a dip, which we would anticipate because that's when a lot of the restrictions went in. Businesses had to close down, only essential workers were out. So that was the point where we had the most restrictions out there. And we see as we continue July, October, January 2021, there's been a steady increase, almost a sign that things are getting back to normal. And we even see by the time we came to January 2021 that we're in a better position than we were January of 2020. So this can be very tricky because this makes it look as if we're doing better. And this could be a factor of many things. One is that companies who were able to successfully transition remotely, maybe prior to the pandemic, they already had the process set up, so it was seamless for them to transition. So that helped with showing the accounts rebounding because the market was better set place to do that transition switch to virtual. But what I want to do, and we'll see it on the next slide here, is this can be a little bit misleading because one can sit and look at this and say, oh, well, the pandemic is over, we're recovering, everything is good, we'll be fine. But there's going to be a little bit of delay. We're still going to be feeling and seeing the impacts on the economy of the pandemic for a little while longer. So that's why it's also important to pay attention and consider these factors as we are addressing our business risk. So what I have here to show you is the last 12-month CIP index as of May 2021. And as you can see, there's been increasing of cost. So the major one, which we could see just kind of blew everyone away here, was energy costs. Energy costs increased by about 28%. So what is included in energy? The biggest two items that had the largest increase, fuel, oil, and gas. So what does that mean for us going forward? You have gas and fuel both saw about a 50% increase in cost. So that means there'll be higher costs to everyone when they go to the pump. For those that have properties that are paying for fuel to heat the buildings and the houses, all those costs are going to go up. So that always has a trickle down effect, because that means we're going to see a rise in expense in our organizations, and also too for the general public who's going to see a rise in expense. Therefore, there's going to be a decrease in their disposable income. So I just wanted to show you, because even though from the prior slide we see that the market is rebounding, everything looks good, this kind of shows us where the costs are going. And we're going to see, particularly in energy, a high rise. Now, one of the things that I did not see when I look at this chart is actually covered in the all items less food and energy. And that is basically the construction. Because from our construction niche here, they actually recently put out an article on the rising cost of construction. And I can actually personally attest to that, because I wanted to do some work on my house. And the quote that I got was just much more than I anticipated. And the contractor, explained to me, lumber increased. He said before it was $3, now it's $9. So that also is going to impact, for people who are doing home improvement, people who are constructing that must finish. They're now doing these things at much higher cost. So there's going to be a little delay of an impact, despite the fact the market looks very good. We still have to be, mindful and assessing this on how this will impact us and our operations as we move forward. So this is another overview of the further impact that we have to take in consideration when assessing our risk, and how basically the market and the industry is going to impact our operations. There's still some companies who fail to recover. We're still in a point where we've known some companies a lot in the food industry that's just shut their doors. And there's some companies now who this has just really been a hard hit for them. They're trying to survive, but they're still losing money. So how would that impact us? Do we have any main vendors that we're using that might be at a risk, where we may have to now research and find other vendors? Permanent changes in operation. What has some companies changed that they've done in the past, and how will that affect you, and how that works with you? And then also, how are you going to change going forward, dealing with your donors, your clients, anyone that you're impacting with your changes that you did as a result of COVID, be it working remotely, via how you deliver your services, everything. What impact does this have? The biggest thing is consumer confidence, which is, although we've seen a large uptick happening with travel, because everyone is just happy for everything to open back up, and they're gone. They're traveling. And I'm very guilty too. I was ready and I was gone. But at the same time, not everyone has that level of confidence. There's still some people that may not feel comfortable going back in certain social settings where they're in large groups. So what would that mean for any fundraising events going on in the future? What type of attendance will we have? Should we, if there's conferences that you usually do, should we be looking into doing a hybrid? So these are all things that, is going to play into impact of how your business is going to evolve going forward, because it might be a little while until the full population feels at ease to go back to the way things were. And just as I mentioned briefly in talking on the other side, there's this delay that we need to be very cognizant of, which is that there's going to be an increase in prices coming down, availability of resources, because a lot of these companies that had to close up shop that were not essential, there was delays in production. So now they're trying to catch back up, but resources might not be there as it was one time. We know going through the pandemic, it hit a point where it was extremely hard to get that PPP equipment, gloves, paper towels, toilet papers, hand sanitizers. Those things, as soon as they hit the shelves, were gone. So these resources, we need to know, like, how's that going to impact us going forward. And then also it affects everyone's bottom line disposable income, because as a not-for-profit, that's one of the main drivers for donors is they have to have the availability of cash in order to donate. So with all of these different factors coming in, that can reduce the disposable income for some people who still have disposable income. There's some people who are still out of work and looking, you know, are they going to be able to give this year like they have in the past? So all of these are the things now that we're 1 year later that we have to look and see how did it impact our entity? How did we do going through? But then also we're not over the hump yet. We need to be forward thinking to say, okay, well, what's going to be coming down and how can we prepare for it? And with that, we've hit our first polling question.
All right, polling question number 1, we are launching. So as a result of COVID-19, have you seen an increase or decrease in operations? A, significant increase, B, slight increase, C, no change, D, small decline, or E, significant decline and or shutdown. And just make sure to get your votes in. This is polling question 1 out of 4 for you to be able to get your CPE credit for today's session. All right, and we're going to close it out in just another 2 seconds. Get those last minute votes in. I see 75% have voted. All right, and we're closing it out.
Okay, if you could share those results for me, Ashley.
Yep, so it looks like 33% voted for C, no change, and then right behind that is a tie for A and E with significant increase and significant decline.
Now, during the year, it's very good to see during the year I've worked on a variety of different not-for-profit clients, and I actually have seen a lot of that, which was very good. I was very happy to see most were able to maintain and some even increase the level of revenue they had during the pandemic. And a lot of it was, again, with the money that the government was putting in for COVID, for a lot of those who had programs that were assisting people in need, where there was this large need now, the government produced a lot of money, put a lot of money into the stream in order to help those individuals. And then also a lot of companies came out and were helping as well. So there was a large increase in order to help with that need that was going on. And at the end of the day, the not-for-profits, your programs and services are needed. That's why you're existent, is because there is a need. And in times like this, that need increased. So I'm happy to see that everyone either were able to stay at a good pace, a good level that they were, or they saw an increase. So that was a very good sign during this time. So what I want to do now is, when we discuss some of those business risks, kind of just go through a little bit again of the things that we discussed last year. But then also, as I go through this section, I want you to reflect on, how did this work for us? Was it good? Are you happy with the transition you made? Is it something that needs to be looked at again, go back and evaluated? Because we did talk about that last year. We'll talk about it again later today, where it's like there's temporary solutions and then there's permanent solutions. So last year when we did this, there was a lot of temporary solutions being placed. So we need to be really reassessing those to see if that temporary can be permanent, or does it need to be updated to really be a permanent solution for us. So with working remotely, one of the biggest things that I think I saw as a struggle had to do with the paying of the bills. Because if you had an organization before that everything comes in via mail and you have someone that, reviews, stamp approved, and then a check is cut, they walk over to the office, they get it signed, it's sent out. That became extremely difficult when offices were closed, because then you had to pick a day to have someone go into office to get the mail, because not everyone was switched remotely that you're getting invoices via email. So how did that work? Was the system able to be developed where, maybe someone goes into office a set amount of times during the week in order to open the mail? Were you able to make the change to have someone that goes open the mail, scan it up, so now it's virtual? That way everyone else can do their approvals, file it away, print the checks? Or was it just easier to have someone to still remain in the office? So that's one of the things that we talk about when we talk about on-site versus remote activities. What were you doing before in paper, and is it possible to have it remote? Now, not everything needs to be remote, but it's just what is the best fit for your organization. And then with staff productivity, you know, is always a great concern. And it's one of those, I guess you could say, touchy subjects that a staff working from home, there is distractions. And this was a very unique type of situation, because this is not the typical work from home. Because in the pandemic, kids were home from school. They had to learn remote as well. So there is added distractions at home, because now you're having to care for people, not just work. So how did that work? Was staff able to maintain and still meet the level as they were doing before, or did we see a decrease? So I know, for our firm here, when, management was reviewing and taking a look, we actually were able to maintain our staff productivity, because with Withum, especially for the auditors, we work remotely. So at the time where we had to go full remotely, it was not that much of a leap for us, because even as we go, many of you, and we do our audits and we're on site, we already have those capabilities to work remotely. So it was easy for us to transition, and we were accustomed to it. For management oversight and monitoring, it becomes a little harder. It's easier for you to see, what's going on when someone's physically there. If there's a quick question, it's easier for you to run and be there to answer, sit down together, talk, get a resolution, and you're done. But working remotely, it could present a little bit of a problem, because you might not always be able to grab the person right then and there, like just walking over to a desk. So how does that work? Like, what did you do in order to compensate that? With the IT environment, and this was one of the ones that definitely was a big thing, where, was your IT environment sufficient enough to take this on? So a lot of people found out that it really was not up to up to par. So during the year, did you have to go out and enhance your IT environment, put up additional security, really have additional licenses for your whole team to be able to work remotely? I actually did have a client, unfortunately, they had a data breach very early on to COVID, and they had multiple entities, and a lot of their information was lost. So that was another thing we talked about last year, that with everyone having to transition virtually in order to continue operations, the fraudsters were there and they were ready. So that was one of the risks of moving to virtual, is your IT environment really has to be up to par. And it's a good thing, because we should have those added securities, because that's a bigger risk now than it was maybe 10, 20 years ago, because most crimes that happen with infiltrating the companies are coming virtually now. So that could be something that positive came out about this whole pandemic, is maybe that was something you were thinking of before, but never actually went ahead and did it. But in order to operate remotely, you went ahead and you upgraded that IT environment. So again, tying in with the IT environment, the biggest item, the biggest risk and issue is securing that information. Because of a lot of the work that we do, you get a lot of sensitive information from donors, from patients. You're getting credit cards if they choose to donate via that way. You have check information that has the bank routing. You may have personal identifiable information like social security numbers, addresses, things like that. So we have to make sure that that information is protected, because that's the key that they go to if they're going to commit fraud. They're trying to get that information. So we have to always make sure we're looking at, are there any weaknesses in this system? And having a good IT department is great for this, even if it's outsourced, because they should be able to come in, review, and evaluate where the weak spots are and can make the recommendations and updates as necessary. So here we have a couple of the different broad specters that are covered under the securing the information. So we look at the way of transferring information. Is everything done via online? Is it a secure network when you're transferring information? For people working remotely at home, what type of protection do they have on their personal home service? Do they have, a basic password that's hard to figure out? Do they have firewalls set up? Are they using their personal equipment as opposed to company equipment? Where if it's your equipment where you can have the necessary firewalls and antivirus software installed, or is this, their home computer that everyone in the family utilizes? And with compliance with privacy rules, we know, especially for those that operate in the healthcare department, um, you're required to protect that certain information. So are we still maintaining that level of privacy as if we were in the office? And for physical records, are staff bringing physical records home in order to complete their work, or are we scanning it and having it securely uploaded to a portal for them to access? And that covers any files that we have, any critical information that we have. Is it properly secured, and can everyone that needs it access it in a safe way to not open up the risk of it being misused? So again, the whole point of this seminar today is we're taking a look 1 year later. So what of these items, what of these risks have we addressed? What have you done to address it? Have we reevaluated to see, okay, yeah, that's still in place, it's working well, or do we need to update it? Always remember that the whole process for business risk assessment is always an ongoing process. So it shouldn't be done at one point, put in place, and we're done. We should always be looking at ways to protect ourselves and our information. Next was your company objective. How does that impacted by this? Now we know a lot of short-term goals probably were not met. The biggest one, which I've talked about a couple of times, is the fundraising goals, because I know many entities, they have, some have multiple fundraising during the year. You may have one large main one during the year. You may have conferences that you rely on for funding, and pretty much almost all of those had to be canceled or had to go remotely. And we've seen a lot of very positives with that too, because on some of the ones that went remotely, particularly with conferences, they had a reach like they did not before, because there's other people located in other states who may not have otherwise been able to attend. Now they are, because it's gone virtual. So now that we've gone through that process and we've seen what our turnout has been, what everyone liked, their feedback, you can decide going forward, okay, what are we going to do for conferences? Are we going to keep a virtual aspect of it so that we can have that far-fetching reach as opposed to in person? For the fundraising events, can we change them in a way to incorporate something maybe virtual? If not virtual, maybe can spread it out into a different type of, setting, so that again, for those consumers who are not confident yet to be in those type of close-knit quarters, that there will be no concern. So these are things that we should consider, how did that impact, what we had planned for last year, and then also how are we going to adapt going forward so that we can meet our goals of growth, the expansion. We talked about the technological updates, marketing, and we always want to evaluate, stabilization. So that's why, as you see me here mention all the time, we talk about it, a plan was put into place. Okay, what do we do now to make it a permanent transition? And I know a lot of you who have those services that are in much need now for those who've been affected negatively by the pandemic. You've seen a large expansion. Is that something that's going to be maintained going forward? So we have to also look at it from that end. For those who've had that extreme growth, can it be sustained going forward, or should we be prepared and constantly monitoring for it if it falls back? Because with large growth comes large expenditures. Now, cash management. Now, this is definitely the highest concern everyone had going into the pandemic and the results, which was to have enough cash flow to cover our expenses and continue to operate. So there was a lot of collection uncertainty for those who may have items that you bill in advance, like for some of the government grants. Thank God I haven't seen any government grant fail to pay on anything that they were contracted to do. But it was a concern because, as we see, the government has been pulling a lot of money and putting out into the CARES Act. So it is reasonable to assess that other departments within the government, they're going to see a decrease in their funding. So I do have a client or two who had some grants that did not renew this year. So that's always something to be concerned of. What is your main revenue stream? And is it possible that you can have issues with them that will affect your projected income? Because if there's no longer their funding, there may be a program that, you may have to take a hit on. And then how do we reduce these expenses without service interruption? That's another floor for us to protect our cash flow reduction of expenses. But at the same time, we never want to reduce it to harm what our mission and what our purpose is. So a lot of the expenses that were reevaluated again were these same expenses that's tied to items we've discussed before, like IT. Once everything is updated, yes, it might be a large investment up front, but there should be a reduced in operating costs going forward if we have it updated. Same thing with office space. I know a lot of people during the pandemic have been, discussing, do they need as much office space now, especially if they have been successful in doing a remote transition. So there's some downsides and maybe there's some saving on rent in that aspect. And then also too, having a system set up in order to timely receive payments. Do you have it set up that those donors can still give and give on time? You can receive your payments and everything is just operating in a timely fashion, because that's what's critical to cash management. It's okay if you have someone that they're going to give you 50,000, but do you have it in a way that you can get 50,000 today instead of having to take 3 months to get it? So all these are things that we have to do, and that's what I was talking about earlier with if you need someone to go in the office to collect the checks, but then that's a process you have to think of if someone has to physically go to the office to open mail for you to get checks. Maybe something that would happen is, if you can have, a lockbox system set up with your local bank so that anyone making donations or paying fees can do it via that method. That way it goes directly into your bank account without the need of someone physically going to collect that money. All these are options that are available to help increase the cash flow or at least maintain it during a time like this. Now, this one I think is one of the hardest things to assess when it comes to business risk, is the ever-changing environment, because it's hard to predict or project what is going to occur. It's almost like you have to wait for the change to happen to see what you're going to do. But then it's very critical when that change happens that you have a process not only to identify that a change has happened, but also to assess it to determine if you're impacted by that change. And if you are impacted by that change, to have a process set in place to handle it. And all these are things that we've seen in the last year. So the non-essential services are reopening, but it's varying by state. So if you contract business outside of New Jersey, what are the restrictions in their state? Are they still opening? Are clients that you're dealing with, vendors that you're dealing with, are they back to full force like we may be here? We've talked about the increase on fraud by going virtual, reduction in the government stimulus. As I've mentioned before, the government put a lot of CARES Act money and other relief funding out there within the past year. But that eventually too will come to an end. When, we're not sure. It seems like every time they come out with a budget, they put the money out. It's kind of like a waiting game to see what next they'll do if there's more. And then if they do put out more, for you to be in a position that you can capitalize. I know we had the first CARES Act funding that occurred around May last year, and then they came out with the second wave earlier this year. So to be in a position to have everything lined up, get the information as soon as they put it out, know what's required, put in your application so you can capitalize on those funds. Increasing the client base and the needs of services. As we see with things starting to open back up, people are going back out to work, you may start to see maybe a decrease for those people who came in as a result of COVID. But there still might be an increase in people who need services for those who were employed by businesses who've been closed. And is it really going to be easy to find other work as other companies are still struggling to reopen and maintain? Also, what are the employee expectations now after all of these changes? So I know a lot of things that, I've heard from many different people along different industries of working is everyone's looking to see, well, okay, what is this firm doing? What are their policies? What is the reality with working remotely? Is it something that's going to be maintained? Can it be maintained? What are the thoughts for any of the changes going forward, considering those people whose kids may still be at home, haven't returned from school, for those people who have elderly parents that maybe, had day facilities that they can no longer go to at this point. So then they're going to be able to, stay at home to work on it. All these are things that, we have to consider. And again, logistics is just how is everything running? Are there new service lines that are out there that can help us deliver our product better? So these things are just constantly changing, and we just have to be ahead of the game and not behind, just as anything with technology that we've been doing before. And so with that, we have polling question number 2.
All right, polling question number 2. Did your organization have a disaster recovery plan in place that was utilized during this pandemic? Yes, our plan was used to react to and navigate the curve. B, we have a plan, but it doesn't cover a situation like this. Or C, no, we do not have a plan. All right, we're going to close out in just a second, get those last minute votes in. And we're closing it out. So it looks like Sam B came in first place. 70% of our audience responded with, we have a plan, but it doesn't cover a situation like this.
Okay, so that was actually the largest number we got last year as well. But for now, 1 year later, that should be changing. Going through this pandemic, we should be able to see what areas we really got hit with that we weren't prepared for, and going through the steps that we're discussing, create a plan, because who knows how long it will be until we really get back to the normalcy, if ever, of what it was before the pandemic. So that's what our focus is going to be. That's why we identify risks, because we want to be able to mitigate them. And we've talked a lot before too on a lot of examples and things that we can do. So as mentioned, we got to be constantly assessing it. And as the ever-changing environment is going on, see as it's impacting you. Communicate often to your staff, to your vendors, to your clients, your donors. whatever they need to be to know what changes are occurring so that everything can happen on a timely basis. You should be taking at least maybe quarterly, however often, but routine analysis of your operations to make sure that things are in point, meeting your expectation. That way you can also see if there are any situations that need your immediate attention occurring. We talked about moving from more temporary to permanent options. And then leverage all the lessons that you've learned throughout this, because that's how we will grow for the future and protect the entity, is seeing what worked, what didn't work, and if it didn't work, what can we change to make it work and make it better. So this is what we do to mitigate the risk. So this is a little summary here of basically the risk assessment process and the goal. So we've done a lot of this already. We've identified business risk under the objectives column. Now you have to measure and then prioritize your risk. Which one is the most critical to you right now? Is it working remotely is more critical to you, or is cash management more critical to you? So everything, you have to identify the risk that is the priority. And then once you've done that, focus on it. Review your processes. Talk amongst the different team members effective, because that's the best way to get the benefits out of it, where you can produce something that covers that issue, the risk that you came up with. It aligns with your strategic goals. The hope is that it will help improve your efficiency and bring value to your company, and also just have a better improvement. So this slide is here for you to review, but this is basically the process of what we do. So in talking today, we've identified some of the objectives that are common. So take the time to take a look to see what really impacts you. And again, do the analysis on your own to see what best helps you and what benefits can you get by putting in new systems in place. When do we need to do a risk assessment? Now, these are a couple of the items that have requirements for risk assessment: the Coastal framework, if you have federal funding, and you have the Yellow Book audit, which is another governmental auditing. Many grant contracts require it, and some boards require it to be done. But besides all that, it should be done constantly because it's very essential to the operations of the firm. So what I have here in the bottom is an article that Withum put up, where it is a risk in itself to not be assessing the risk. So if you have a moment of time, you can follow the link, and there's a nice short article there on all the risk associated, again, by just not assessing the risk. But I think from even being here today, you've taken that step where you're having the thought process. We're covering a lot of things that should be reflected on. So it's a great sign to have you here. So here's some other example of the risk. Now we've talked about all of these in very broad concepts, but here, if you look at it, especially on the diagram, these all affect the sustainability of an entity. So internally, we talked about, the IT, your staff, theft, or the controls you had before working. Training, we didn't touch too much on that, but that's one that should have been there from the beginning. It's always a risk that we need to make sure our staff is properly trained. And then for the pandemic, what it has added is a lot of external risk, which in this case, we fall under the natural disasters. So that puts the pressure on everything internal, but then also it touches on everything external. What other rules and governance now has come out as a result of this? So all of these items we should be reviewing as it impacts our entity, because this will affect the ability for us to continue to proceed in a successful manner. So with that, polling question number 3.
All right, polling question number 3. Who owns or manages the key risks in your organization? A, compliance and/or regulatory department. B, internal audit. C, executive management. D, board of directors or the equivalent. 4E, operational employees. Make sure to get those polling question answers in. We only have one more left. And then a nice trivia question I see in there. All right, and we're going to close it out. And it looks like C, executive management, came in at the top with 64, and then behind that was at 27% of the votes, being with A, compliance and/or regular.
Now, the risk assessment policies, like we've seen similar results to last year, but it's really something for the whole organization to do. Because although, yes, a lot of the risk assessment, the new internal controls come from the executive committee, from management, still the operational staff sees the results of these controls being placed. So it's always good to at least survey or poll your staff to see, is it really working as we intend it to work? And if it's not, how can we fix this? So it should really involve all aspects and everyone of the company for it to truly be successful. And that gets us to this effective communication. Now, communication as you give it out should be tailored based on the audience that you're talking to, because certain information you have for employees will differ for clients, will differ for donors. But most importantly, in this time, communication is everything. So constant communication, that way everyone is aware of what changes you've come out with, what your expectations are, especially for the employees, what they need to do. For your clients, any service changes they need to be aware of, especially as things are reopening and changes are occurring. You know, if you're reopening, make sure to get that communication out. If you have requirements for anyone coming in person again for your services, make sure they're fully aware ahead of time. And again, your payment options, you know, did you do a new system during this time that they need to be aware of that would make it easier for them? And donors, the same thing. Any information that needs or affect them should be communicated to them in a timely manner. And you should always make sure then, of course, that you have the updated best communication line. Vendors and everyone else. So it's not just employees, it's not just your clients, it's not just your donors. Everyone should be aware of any changes that might impact you. Even vendors, if there's going to be a change in your service now that you're opening back up, you're going to need more, communicate to them in a timely manner so that way you do not see service delays. And just anyone else, whether it's any reporting entities you have to do with a lot of the grants, communicate to them early on if there's any issues that you're having, because it just makes everything flow a little bit better once everyone is on the same page. So communication is definitely key in getting these changes that you're implemented out to the people that need to be aware of it. And I talked about this before, that real-time analysis. You should have budgets. I know last year a lot of people, they had their budgets as of January 1st, 2020, and then they revised them as a result for COVID, which is important because if there's a major change in factor, revise that budget, because this is a key for you to analyze how are you doing. And in this case, frequent monitoring and review, that lets you know how are you doing. That allows you to find those problems timely and address them. And again, the changes in service volume, which I've talked about, which is not only are we going to see increasing costs from our slide earlier, but there is an increase in demand based on how many people were impacted by the pandemic. But that demand can also take a turn and go down. So if you have these increased costs because you're expecting an increase in demand, be very careful if that demand is going to change, because you don't want to have to maintain a certain level of cost and that demand then starts to decrease. This we talked about, so I mentioned temporary versus permanent. So this was a slide from last year's presentation. So I want you to, in your time, take a look. Did you have any of these temporary solutions, and have you revised them yet for permanent? Is your permanent solution, everyone's going to come back into the office, we're not going to be working remotely anymore? Or are you going to do a hybrid? Or are they going to be working remotely exclusively? Have you talked to them about their personal equipment? Have you had certain requirements, maybe a policy that you put down in writing to them to say what you require to be done, the minimum for use of personal equipment? Or have you purchased equipment that they need to be able to come and get, so they're utilizing the company's protected equipment as opposed to their personal? How has the workflow go? Are you still up keeping with everything that needs to be done? And as we see, a good permanent solution to do at this time, it might be difficult, but as much physical that can be stored electronically, that's a good permanent to put into place, because it has shown us, if anything, that that's the best way to share information at a time like this. And where a lot of things are kept in the office, and even someone trying to work remotely, and it's like, oh wait, I can't do this because I have to go to the office and get this. It really slows down and impacts our efficiency. So we should really take a look. What did we do temporarily just so that we could keep operations and go? Now's the time we should be assessing it. Does that solution work on a permanent basis, or should we be replacing it with something more permanent? And polling question number 4.
All right, polling question 4. What size organization would benefit from assessing and addressing risk on a regular basis? A, less than 50 employees. B, any organization over 100 employees. C, only public companies. Or D, organizations over 1,000 employees. All right, only 7% of the votes have come in. I want to see at least 90. So get in your last votes for this last polling question here. And we'll close out in just a second. All right. And we're closing it out. And 73% have voted for B, any organization over 100 employees.
All right, so in this case, really every organization should be looking at and assessing the risk and reviewing all the impacts that they have. But it doesn't really matter the size. We should be looking at everything. And that actually leads us into the results of our risk mitigation, which is everything we've talked about, everything that we've reviewed. What is the end game? Why are we going to go through this process? Well, we want to increase our donor and employee confidence, because if you're ahead of the game and you're proactive as opposed to reactive, then everyone will build confidence in you and your organization, because they'll see that, okay, you're on top of it. You can then prevent and detect fraud before they occur and be able to save yourself from the risk of loss. Just overall continual improvement with your organization. It will improve your efficiency. It will improve your ability to react when new potential business donors, anything that comes out. I know grants, they require a lot of information. So if you're ready and going, you can take, you'll be able to take advantage of things as they pop up in a timely manner. Again, positive financial results. That's what we all want. We want to hit a point where, we're earning the money that we need to support our service and not be operating in the red. And we get to realize those goals and objectives that we've set, and the mission and the overall mission for our organization. So this is why we're doing what we're doing. This is why we review this information, and that's why it's important, and we put this much emphasis on it. So I talked about it kind of early on in the first slide, but these are some other lingering implications that we have as a result of the COVID, things that we need to be constantly thinking about. Know what your clients are thinking. I talked about consumer confidence. How do they feel about those services that are done, or how do they feel about the changes you've done for services? I know there's some not-for-profits that I've worked on that had the ability to convert their services from in-person to virtual. Well, how do the clients like that? Is that something they want to continue, or is that something like, no, they prefer to be back in person and they would want that to be done? Maybe you could do a hybrid of the two. So wherever possible, take advantage of polls, surveys, just ask them to get an idea of what's working best. What does your donors think? How, have conversations with them. What do they see going on in the future? Can they be something you can rely on in the future? Or maybe, they're a little hesitant. Maybe for those that were hesitant at the beginning of COVID, who held back on funding because of cash management, hey, reach out to them today. Are they going to be open back to giving again? Are they going to be making this change anytime soon? Make changes to your long-term plans as necessary. Were you thinking about expanding like physical locations? Is that still something that can be done? Or maybe investing and expanding in the virtual environment might be a better mix this time. And also, we're starting to see a little bit, but we still don't know what the new normal will be. Right now, as an environment, we're in a place where people are slowly going back into the office, and staff are slowly have to get acclimated, to the new way. Still wearing the mask, we're still sanitizing, we're still paying attention to respecting distances. So we haven't fully seen what our new normal might be, but for right now, we need to be constantly evaluating that change as it's occurring. And with that, similar to last year, we have our trivial question at the end. So for this year, I have, during the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, total charitable giving decreased by how much? And the reason why I picked this question in particular is because just as everything we've talked about reflecting, some of the best things that we have to help us project for the future is for things that happened in the past. And one of the largest losses we occurred was the Great Recession in 08 and 09. And there was a lot of loss occurred. So that length of time it took to recover from there gives us a good starting point outlook on what we can expect in recovery this time around.
All right. So the votes have come in. Let's see what the consensus is, Sam.
Okay.
So it looks like most people, 83% said 13.3%, 9.0% in 2008, and 6.7% in 2009. And I believe the right answer is what 17% had voted for, which was 13.2%, 7.0% in 2008, and 6.2% in 2009.
Right. So it was a 13% decrease in giving, that is correct, that occurred between 08 and 09, with 010 starting to see an increase and a return. Now, when you think about the Great Recession and all the risks that occurred through there, because the Great Recession was a result to the crash of the real estate market, and that impacted giving by 13%. And so far, I've seen this time around, and from some of the polls that we've put out, it doesn't seem like that impact has been that great yet here. And I think that we'll be able to recover well. But seeing that we were able to bounce back, that took 2 years before giving started to increase again. And that ties into a lot of factors, including confidence. So this too, like everything, will pass. And it's nice to see that, the impact hasn't been too hard, but now we can focus again on our growth and moving forward. So I thank you all for joining us today, and really appreciate your time.
Please just make sure everybody to take the survey that will pop up after we close out. And yes, everybody, thank you for attending and have a great weekend. Thank you.